This is the story of Lydia Attlee and her unborn child. She disappeared from her home village on the night of July 22, 1850. In July 1850, Lydia Attlee was unmarried and heavily pregnant, living in the village of Ringstead in Northamptonshire, England. She was about 24 years old at that time. Her widowed, or deserted mother had died in the May, leaving Lydia living with her 18-year-old brother, Henry, and a friend, Mary Ann Manning, who had been staying with her at night since Lydia's mother had died. She was, by all accounts, an auburn-haired, well-liked amiable character, if not the brightest of girls. Her good nature was probably taken advantage of by the local men. This was Lydia's third pregnancy. Her first illegitimate child was born in 1846, named after her brother, Henry. Being a pauper, this child was born into the workhouse at Thrapston, which was sited about 3 miles from her mother's home. When the child was 2 years old, she decided to leave him in the care of the workhouse, in a bid to restart her life. By today's standards, this seems rather callous, but we should not be too judgmental, given the conditions in which these people had to eke out their existence. Lydia could barely look after herself, let alone a child, especially as she had scurvy, which was likely the cause of lameness in one leg. Her only source of income was from selling nuts and oranges. Unfortunately, she became pregnant again in 1848, but this daughter died in infancy. She was probably hoping she would be able to better provide for this next child. Although, it is not certain, it was universally agreed at the time that the father was a local butcher, one William Weekly Ball, who was about 5 years her senior. Ball had married a Hannah Page in 1843, who appears to have been a somewhat meek character, who was likely well aware of her husband's philandering. They did not have any children together. Lydia was hoping that Ball would provide some financial assistance for this child. Lydia and Ball were known to have open liaisons, but the one on 22nd of July 1850 was more of a confrontation. It took place in Ball's orchard, which was at the back of his property. According to one witness, John Hill, who had known Ball for 30 years, they were in the lane leading to the back gate of Ball's orchard, on the evening of the July 22nd. He claimed to hear Lydia remonstrating with Ball, saying, "I won't, it's yours and nobody else's." Skulking behind a hedge, Hill heard Lydia exclaim, "I won't go in there, Weekly, not tonight," which she repeated, possibly twice. Lydia then appeared to be backing away, and Ball then may have gotten hold of her, whereby, Hill believed they entered the orchard. Hill then made his way home. Another witness was Joseph Groom. He was effectively Lydia's brother-in-law, despite Groom and her younger sister, Elizabeth, not being married and not even living under the same roof, but already having children together. They did eventually marry in 1859. Groom claimed to be near the orchard at the relevant time, overhearing a heated argument between Lydia and Ball. Specifically, he heard Lydia say, "Get off me, for I believe you mean killing me tonight, Weekly Ball. The Lord have mercy on me, if I am going to die in the state that I am in." Groom could not actually see what was happening, but thought that it sounded like a physical altercation was in progress and heard no further words spoken. Instead, he heard screaming and a grumbling noise. Others heard the screaming, including John Hill's wife. John Hill had also claimed to have met Ball the following afternoon, walking across a field carrying a hoe, but did nothing. Bizarrely, no one considered this worthy of further investigation. In fact, they were more concerned with their own reputation, not wanting to be perceived as nosy neighbors. Consequently, they did not report any of this until much later. In Groom's case, I suspect the obvious inference of his rather cowardly withdrawal from the scene, with no concern for Lydia, may have played into his initial decision to remain silent. After her meeting with Ball on the evening of July 22, Lydia Attlee was never seen, nor heard from, ever again. Unsurprisingly, the village rumor mill went into overload, culminating with the police, finally, being notified. Inevitably, William Ball was arrested and the police began an investigation. However, the principal witnesses were still remaining tight-lipped at that point, so the magistrates released Ball due to a lack of evidence for any crime, let alone murder. Ball was not off the hook though. The residents of Ringstead were convinced of Ball's guilt, so set about their own search for Lydia. Any place that could be, was dug up, the river and ponds were explored, but to no avail. Lydia had seemingly vanished. Then a resident of the village received a letter from her son stating that he had seen Lydia with a man, alive and well, in Northampton. This development convinced the police to completely lose interest. However, the authorities recognized that something untoward had happened to Lydia and a notice was placed in the local newspaper, the Northampton Mercury, in an attempt to encourage any potentially vital witness. A £50 reward being offered for information leading to the arrest of the murderer. That was a great deal of money in 1850, equivalent to more than £5,000 today. Still no one came forward. The villagers were not satisfied though. Ball was labelled the cruel butcher of Ringstead, in a ballad that surfaced at a Thrapston fair in the October of 1850. William Ball's continued presence in Ringstead became untenable, due to the widespread hostility directed towards him, which no doubt would have seriously affected his business. He was forced to relocate to the small town of Ramsey, a good 30 miles from Ringstead. And there he prospered for the next 14 years. In 1864, a labourer called Richard Warren was digging a ditch in a field just outside of the boundary of Ringstead village, when he unearthed the skeletonized remains of a woman. She was laid face down, with her feet towards the Denford Road and her head towards the hedge. There was no evidence of clothing and the bones were well preserved. The burial had been at a depth of about 18 inches, or 45 centimeters, in moist soil. A Thrapston surgeon, John Griffith Leet, was employed to oversee exhumation of the body and the subsequent examination. Unfortunately, Leet had no forensic knowledge. Nonetheless, he concluded that the body had been in the ground for 12 to 20 years and was clearly female, of middle age, about 5 feet 2 inches, with a tooth missing at the time of interment. Lydia was known to have had a tooth removed not long before she disappeared, by a relative, Henry Dix. Dix was of the opinion that the jaw with the missing tooth was Lydia's. Leet was convinced that the body was Lydia, but quite how he could make that judgment is unknown. The cause of death was never determined. There was no evidence of any fetal remains, although there was not a full and proper examination of the burial earth. The surgeon had sketched the remains, but not in situ, and not analyzed, only observed, the soil beneath the burial. Leet was of the opinion that any fetal remains would probably have completely decomposed after 14 years anyway. Needless to say, William Ball's life was going to be turned on its head once more. He was arrested for murder soon after the discovery of the skeleton. The committal proceedings were held at the courthouse in Thrapston, beginning on the February 24, 1864, a large crowd had gathered, convinced of Ball's guilt. Joseph Groom and John Hill told their respective stories, but Ball had been able to secure excellent counsel in Mr. Gotches, a solicitor from Peterborough, who cast aspersions on Hill and Groom, claiming that Hill was running a brothel and that Groom had sex with Lydia. As for Hill's accusation of seeing Lydia with Ball in the back lane, Ball suggested that it wasn't he, but a local baker, James Wilkinson, and that he could be the father of the child she was carrying. There was one trump card left in the prosecution's hand, the letter sent by William Weekly to his mother, Eliza, stating he had seen Lydia in Northampton. It transpired that Ball knew this William Weekly, though they were not related, and knew that his mother lived in Ringstead. Apparently, Ball went to Northampton a couple of weeks after Lydia's disappearance, expressly to solicit the assistance of Weekly, asking him to write the letter, including a note for his mother to pass it on to Ball. Eliza Weekly was essentially illiterate, so had no idea what the letter was actually about. This seemed to be damning. Although the prosecution could not produce the original letter, the policeman that Ball had shown the letter to all those years ago, had had the good sense to copy its contents. Finally, despite the valiant defense provided for Ball, this revelation proved to be the determining factor. Gotches persisted with his protestations that there was no proof of Lydia's murder, and therefore, no reason to believe Ball had murdered her. William Weekly Ball was found guilty of willful murder, whereupon he was committed for trial at Northampton Assizes. It seemed that after 14 years of suspicion, Ball was finally going to get his comeuppance. Yet, it was not so, because on the March 5, 1864, another skeleton, this time of a man, was discovered only yards from where Lydia's supposed body was found, which was assessed to have been buried around the same time. Then, 2 more corpses were unearthed in the same vicinity. This of course, completely undermined the case against Ball, so he was released forthwith, a jubilant free man, despite the fact that he could still be prosecuted at a later date. However, the court of public opinion were still adamant of his guilt, which probably did affect his butcher business in Ramsey, though clearly less so than in Ringsted. He was able to continue until well into the 1870s. His wife died in 1874. 2 years later he married Catherine Catling, who was about 10 years his junior. Strangely, they married in London. Sometime around then, he purchased about 7 acres of land in the Ramsey district, latterly becoming a farmer. Whether this was purely by choice, is not known. He had retired altogether by 1891, dying in 1896, aged 78. Now, you would imagine that this would be the end of the story, but there was yet another twist to come. In the same area that the other bodies were found, another female skeleton was unearthed in 1906. She was about 30 years of age, with a rusted cutthroat razor lying next to her. It may be that none of these bodies related to Lydia Atlee. In fact, it was thought that the area where they were found had been a gypsy burial ground at the time the bodies were interred. I think though that the body found in 1906 was very likely a murder victim. Who was she? Could it have been Lydia? Circumstantially, while it may not be certain, I think it is infinitely probable that Ball murdered Lydia. Given that Lydia was heavily pregnant, very near to giving birth, had scurvy and a bad leg, there is really no possibility that she could have gone very far. If she had given birth, that would equally apply. So, we have to conclude that she was unlawfully killed. The burial site that may have contained her remains was about half a mile from Ball's orchard. It isn't inconceivable that she could have walked to that location, but for what purpose? If she had been murdered, she very likely would have simultaneously given birth, so the baby would not necessarily be found within her skeleton. Lydia's age is in question. The 1841 census indicates she was born about 1826, while the 1850 Police Gazette gives her age as 27. Therefore, it would seem that she was a little younger than the bodies that were found. This assumes that they were correctly dated, which is by no means certain. She had a very hard life, which could prematurely age her skeleton. So, it is possible. Could Ball have somehow removed Lydia's body from the orchard and transported it the half-mile to the supposed burial site? There is no indication he had access to a horse and cart. Carrying or dragging her body that distance would have been quite a feat. Even at night there would have been a severe risk of being spotted by a resident. That said, John Hill's accusation that he saw Ball walking across a field with a hoe, isn't all that convincing. For one, he would have needed a shovel. If he had dragged or carried the body across a field at a time when people were about, that would have been incredibly audacious. I wonder whether the bodies discovered were just a red herring. He apparently seemed pretty nonchalant about this in court. Maybe because he knew that wasn't Lydia. We don't know whether an excavation was carried out in Ball's orchard. If he had killed her there, that would seem the easiest location to bury her. Of course, he was a butcher by profession, so had the skills and tools to dismember her body fairly quickly, which would make disposal less difficult. Her remains could have been deposited in more than one location. Still, a risky pursuit, nonetheless. I am of the opinion that the only explanation for Lydia's disappearance is that Ball murdered her. The only question is, where did he bury her? If only Joseph Groom had acted more gallantly, he might have saved her, or at least witnessed her murder. Unless, Groom's testimony was an invention concocted to implicate Ball, given that everyone had already decided he was guilty. After all, he was her brother-in-law, so his sister may have influenced what he said. Maybe she wasn't killed in the orchard, but inside his house. I cannot conceive of any scenario whereby Lydia met with foul play by another hand, or died accidentally in a way that her body would not be found. It is possible that Ball's wife was complicit. Maybe she assisted him in the disposal of the body, wherever that may have been. There is little chance this mystery will ever be resolved. Any remains would have rotted away long ago and be beyond identification. William Weekly Ball lived a long and relatively prosperous life, albeit one blighted by the rumor mill. I think we can safely say that he got away with murder. Incidentally, the courthouse still stands today, subsequently becoming the Courthouse Inn, around 1930. The kitchen had once been the police station and the building included holding cells, which were where the toilets are now situated. And as for Henry Atlee, the child Lydia left in the workhouse, well, he survived the workhouse and had returned to live in Ringstead by the age of 14, as a household servant. But, by 1871, he was living in Wednesbury in Staffordshire, working as a mechanic. In late 1872 he married an Emma Partridge. She died in 1874, following childbirth, however the child survived and appears on the 1891 census. He remarried in 1886 to a Mary West, with whom he had at least 3 children. By 1891, he was the manager of the local nuts and bolts works. Sadly, he died the same year as his mother's murderer, 1896, aged 50. Interestingly, in the marriage records, he gave his father as Joseph Atlee, a carpenter. Was this a total invention, or could his father have been Joseph Groom?